The memory box. The old wooden chair creaked softly as Henry settled into his usual spot on the front porch. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the world moved just a little slower, and the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. In his hands, he held a small, weathered box, its edges rounded from years of being touched, opened, and closed. Inside, beneath the lid carved with delicate patterns of vines and flowers, lay a collection of objects. A pocket watch that had stopped ticking long ago, a faded photograph of his late wife, a letter written in a shaky but familiar hand, and a single folded dollar bill. To anyone else, these were just trinkets. But to Henry, they were pieces of a lifetime, each carrying a lesson he had learned, sometimes the hard way. He ran his fingers over the watch, its once polished surface now dull with age. Time. It was the one thing people always asked about. "How old are you now, Henry?" And with that question came a shift. The way they looked at him, the way they spoke, the quiet assumptions they made. When he was younger, his age was just a number, but now it felt like a label, a box they put him in before they even knew his name. That was the first lesson. Not everything needs to be shared. Some things are better left unspoken. Henry placed the watch back and picked up the letter. It was from a friend. Well, a friend once. Money had come between them, as it often did. He had once believed in helping without hesitation, but experience had taught him otherwise. People changed when money entered the conversation, and what started as kindness could quickly turn into expectation, resentment, even betrayal. With a deep sigh, Henry folded the letter and set it aside. His fingers brushed over the photograph next. His wife's smile was still as bright as he remembered, frozen in time. After she passed, people had told him to move on, to find love again. But when he did, whispers followed. At his age, isn't he too old for that? As if love had an expiration date. As if his heart had somehow stopped beating just because hers had. A cool breeze rustled the porch curtains, and Henry closed the box gently. He had learned so much in his 76 years, but the most important lessons weren't found in books or taught in school. They were learned through experience, through heartbreak, disappointment, and quiet moments of realization. There are things we carry with us, not because they should be shared, but because keeping them close gives us peace. He leaned back, watching the river in the distance, its steady flow mirroring the passing of time. The past had taught him well. There are 9 things, 9 sacred truths, that should remain yours alone. And today, I want to share them with you, not so you can tell the world, but so you can find the strength in silence, just as I have. Before we begin, take a moment. Have you ever regretted sharing something too soon? Have you ever wished you had kept a part of yourself just for you? If so, you're not alone. As we walk through this journey together, I invite you to reflect on your own life, your own experiences. And if this story resonates with you, if these lessons feel like the wisdom you've been searching for, consider leaving a comment. Let's learn from one another. Let's build a space where wisdom is passed down, not judged. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because these conversations, these reflections, they matter. Now let's begin. Lesson 1. Age. A number does not define you. Henry traced the edge of the pocket watch with his thumb, feeling the smooth, worn-down surface. It had belonged to his father, then to him, and now it sat in his old, weathered hands, silent, still, frozen in time. Strange, he thought, how something meant to measure time no longer does. And yet, it still holds its worth. For most of his life, age had never been something he thought much about. As a child, he had counted the years eagerly, waiting to grow, older, to be taken seriously. As a young man, he had been proud of his years, wearing them like a badge of honor, proof of his experience and strength. But somewhere along the way, that changed. He remembered the first time he felt it, the shift in how people saw him. He had been at the grocery store, reaching for a bag of flour, when a young man rushed over. "Here, sir, let me help you with that," he had said, his tone polite but pitying. Henry had smiled, thanked him, but deep down, something in him had sunk. It happened more often after that. People speaking louder when they talked to him, as if his ears had suddenly failed him. Strangers calling him sir with an almost patronizing sweetness. And worst of all, the moment someone asked, "How old are you now?" As soon as he answered, their eyes changed. He was no longer Henry, the man who had traveled the world, who had built a life with his own 2 hands. No, he was just an old man, a number, a fading shadow of his former self. That was the day he decided to stop answering the question, because the truth was, age didn't define him. His years were not a measurement of his worth, his ability, or his spirit. Some people at 70 were far more alive than those at 30. Some people at 80 still loved, still dreamed, still laughed with the full force of life. And yet, society had a way of placing people into boxes, and once they knew your age, they thought they knew your limits. So Henry stopped letting them. Now, when someone asked, "How old are you?" he simply smiled and said, "Old enough to know. Better, young enough to still be curious." And that was enough. Because the truth was, his age was his own. A quiet companion, not a label for others to define him by. He placed the pocket watch back into the wooden box. It no longer ticked, but it was still precious, just like him. Because time only matters if you let it. And Henry? He had decided a long time ago that he was not a number. He was a man, a life still unfolding, a story still being written. Lesson 2. Money, silence, keeps peace. Henry reached into his wooden box and pulled out a folded dollar bill, its edges frayed from years of being handled. It wasn't much, just a single bill, but to him it represented something far greater than its monetary value. It was a reminder, a lesson learned through experience, through heartbreak. He used to believe that honesty about money was a sign of trust. After all, what harm was there in sharing how much he had saved, what he had earned, or how he chose to spend? But life had a way of teaching him otherwise. He thought back to his younger years when he had lent money to a friend, someone he had known since childhood, someone he had trusted. The friend had fallen on hard times, and Henry, without hesitation, had opened his wallet. "Pay me back when you can," he had said, never imagining that those words would be the beginning of the end. At first, there had been gratitude. Then, excuses. Then, silence. The money was never returned, but worse than that, the friendship had dissolved into something ugly, resentment, avoidance, an unspoken debt that weighed heavier than any dollar amount. Then there was family. He had once believed that blood meant protection, that generosity would bring them closer. But he had seen how money had the power to twist even the strongest of bonds. He had watched as siblings turned into rivals over an inheritance, as kindness was mistaken for an open checkbook, as gifts became expectations, and the whispers. Oh, the whispers. The moment people knew how much he had, they looked at him differently. Some assumed he had more to give. Some resented him for having it at all. Some pitied him if they thought he had little. It was as if his worth had been reduced to a bank balance, a number that determined how he was treated. So Henry had learned. Now, when conversations drifted toward money, he smiled and changed the subject. When someone asked how much he had saved, he answered simply, "Enough." When a relative hinted at a loan, he replied with a gentle, "I wish I could." Because peace was worth more than wealth. He placed the dollar bill back into the box, smoothing its worn surface with his fingers. It was a relic of a lesson that had cost him more than money. It had cost him trust, relationships, and moments he could never get back. But now he held on to something even more valuable: his dignity, his autonomy, his quiet sense of security. Because, in the end, money could be earned, spent, lost, and regained. But peace of mind, once taken, it was far harder to recover. And so, Henry chose silence. Not out of secrecy, not out of greed, but out of wisdom. Because the less people knew, the more he truly owned. Lesson 3. Family. Home is a place of shelter, not judgment. Henry lifted a worn, sepia-toned photograph from his wooden box. It was of his family, his wife, his son, his daughter, standing on the front porch of their old home, all smiles, frozen in a moment of happiness. But as his fingers traced the edges, he could still remember the arguments, the misunderstandings, the hurt that had once seeped through those very walls. He had learned the hard way that family matters were best kept within the family. Years ago, during a heated Thanksgiving dinner, his son and daughter-in-law had a falling out. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, and by the time dessert was served, the warmth in the room had been replaced by cold silence. The next day, still frustrated, Henry had made the mistake of venting to a neighbor, thinking nothing of it. It was just a conversation, casual, offhanded. But as words traveled, they twisted. By the time the story made its way back, his son was painted as ungrateful, his daughter-in-law as controlling. The private pain of his family had become neighborhood gossip, and instead of helping heal the wound, Henry had unknowingly made it deeper. That was the first time he saw the power of silence. He had also seen it in others, families torn apart, not by their own conflicts, but by the opinions of outsiders. Friends who let too many people into their marriages, only to find themselves drowning in unwanted advice. Parents who aired their children's mistakes in public, never realizing how deep the wounds of embarrassment could cut. He had learned that sharing family problems with the world didn't solve them. It only gave others a front-row seat to watch them unravel. Because at the end of the day, no one else felt the weight of a broken bond like the people inside it. No neighbor, no co-worker, no distant relative could truly understand the love, the history, the unspoken threads that held a family together. And no one, no matter how well-meaning, could put those pieces back together once they had been broken by careless words. So Henry chose differently. Now when friends asked about his family, he spoke only of the good, the birthdays, the milestones, the laughter. If there was conflict, he faced it within the walls of his home, not in the court of public opinion. Because family wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, filled with moments of both deep love and deep frustration. But it was also sacred. A shelter, not a spectacle. He placed the photograph back into the box, pressing it down gently, as if sealing a promise to himself. Some things, he had learned, weren't meant for the world to judge. They were meant to be protected, nurtured, and above all, kept safe in the place they belonged, at home. Lesson 4. Health. I am more than my illness. Henry opened his wooden box and pulled out an old prescription bottle, the label faded from time. It was empty now, long past its use, but he kept it as a reminder, not of sickness, but of something far more important. There was a time when he thought sharing his health struggles was natural, even necessary. After all, wasn't that what people did? They talked about their aches and pains, their doctor visits, their medications. It was how friends connected over morning coffee, how family showed concern. But over time, Henry noticed something troubling. The more he shared about his health, the more people started to see him only through the lens of his illness. It started subtly. A friend would tilt their head sympathetically when he mentioned his arthritis. A neighbor would place a gentle hand on his shoulder, as if he might break at any moment. Conversations that once felt full of life became cautious, careful, as if he were suddenly fragile, something to be handled delicately. Then came the unsolicited advice. Have you tried this new supplement? You should really stop eating bread. I read an article about a miracle cure. You should look into it. People meant well, but it was exhausting. One day, at his weekly card game, Henry found himself listening to an endless exchange of ailments, hip replacements, heart medications, blood pressure readings. It struck him then how much of their conversation revolved around what was wrong rather than what was right. They weren't talking about books or travels or even the weather. They were talking about their decline, as if that was all they had left. That was the day Henry made a decision. He would no longer let his health define him. From then on, when people asked how he was feeling, he simply said, "I'm doing well. Thanks for asking." If he was in pain, he acknowledged it quietly to himself. But he didn't let it dictate his conversations. If someone pried, he gently changed the subject, because he realized that his body might have limitations, but his spirit did not. He refused to let illness become his identity. He was still Henry, the man who loved fishing, who told the best jokes at family dinners, who could fix anything with his hands. He was not just a diagnosis. Henry placed the empty prescription bottle back into the box and shut the lid. His health was a part of him, yes. But it was just one part. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would live, not as a patient, not as a condition, but as a man who still had stories to tell, because he was, and always would be, more than his illness. Lesson 5. Love. Something sacred, not for the world to judge. Henry reached into his wooden box and pulled out a delicate gold ring, simple, unadorned, yet heavy with meaning. It had belonged to his late wife, Margaret. He held it between his fingers, feeling its warmth, as if a part of her still remained within the metal. Love had been the greatest gift of his life. But it had also been one of his most private battles. When Margaret passed, Henry had thought his heart would never open again. Grief was a quiet, suffocating thing, and for years he carried it alone. People offered condolences, spoke of moving forward, of cherishing memories. But no one truly understood how empty the world felt without her laughter filling their home, without the touch of her hand in his. Then, unexpectedly, love found him again. Her name was Eleanor. She was kind, full of life, with eyes that still held the curiosity of youth. She never tried to replace Margaret. She simply walked beside Henry in a way that made the days feel lighter. With her, he laughed again, dreamed again. But the world was not as kind as she was, people whispered. At his age, what's the point? Some scoffed, saying love belonged to the young, as if hearts stopped beating at a certain number. Even his own children, though well-meaning, struggled to accept that their father could love again. Henry learned then that love was something sacred, too precious to be offered for the world's approval. He realized that the more he spoke of it, the more it became something to be judged, to be scrutinized. Love was not for debate. It was not something to justify. It was simply meant to be felt, to be cherished. So he stopped explaining. He and Eleanor shared quiet mornings by the lake, reading in the soft golden light of dawn. They held hands during evening walks, savoring the feeling of presence, of companionship. They built a love that needed no validation, because love, in its purest form, required nothing but the two souls who shared it. As Henry held the ring now, he smiled softly. Margaret had been the love of his youth, Eleanor the love of his golden years. Both were real, both were his. He placed the ring back into the box and closed it gently. Some things were meant to be whispered only between hearts. Love was not meant for the world's judgment. It was meant to be lived. Lesson 6. Charity. True kindness needs no applause. Henry reached into his wooden box and pulled out a small folded receipt, yellowed with age but still legible. It was from a grocery store dated years ago, from a day most had long forgotten. But Henry never would. It was a cold winter evening when he had stood in line behind a young mother. She clutched a handful of food items, her fingers trembling as she counted the bills in her palm. Henry watched as her shoulders sagged. She didn't have enough. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, handed the cashier the extra amount, and gave the woman a reassuring nod. She had looked at him with eyes full of gratitude, her voice cracking, as she whispered, "Thank you." He had simply smiled and said, "Take care." Then he had walked away. It was a small gesture, nothing grand, nothing worth remembering, except that he did. Because true kindness isn't about being seen. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Henry had learned this lesson the hard way. There was a time when he had believed in sharing his charitable acts, not out of arrogance, but because he thought it would inspire others to do the same. He had once donated a significant sum to a local shelter, and when asked to speak about it at an event, he had agreed. He stood on a stage, shaking hands, accepting appreciation, but something about it felt off. Later, a man at the shelter approached him quietly and said, "Thank you for what you did, sir, but I hope you know, some of us don't want to be seen as charity cases. We just want to be treated like people." That sentence stayed with him. Henry realized then that giving wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about the praise or the acknowledgement. It was about the dignity of those receiving. So, he changed. He started giving quietly, anonymously. A bag of groceries left at a neighbor's door. A coat donated without a name. A bill paid, without expectation of thanks. And something beautiful happened. Giving became purer, lighter. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the act itself, about the lives it touched in ways he might never fully know. Now, as he held the faded receipt in his hands, he smiled softly. That moment in the grocery store had come and gone, and the woman likely never thought of him again. But that was the beauty of it. Kindness doesn't need to be remembered to matter. He folded the receipt back into the box and closed the lid. Because true generosity isn't measured in applause, but in the quiet difference it makes in someone's life. Lesson 7. Honor. Silence preserves dignity. Henry ran his fingers over an old military medal, its once polished surface now dulled with time. It was tucked inside his wooden box, hidden from sight, though many would say it deserved to be displayed. But Henry had learned long ago that true honor wasn't found in the things people could see. It was found in the things they couldn't. There was a time when he believed differently. When he was younger, he had been proud of his achievements, his years of service, the sacrifices he had made, the moments when he had stood tall and done the right thing even when it was hard. And like many men, he had once thought that honor was something to be spoken about, to be recognized. But life had a way of teaching him otherwise. He remembered a conversation he had overheard at a cafe years ago. Two men were sitting at the next table, each trying to outdo the other with stories of their successes. Who had earned more, who had seen more, who had sacrificed more. Their voices grew louder with each tale, their pride swelling with every word. But as Henry watched, he noticed something. No one around them was truly listening. They were talking to impress, but no one was impressed. That day, Henry understood something valuable. True honor doesn't demand attention, It speaks for itself in the quiet dignity of one's actions. He thought of the greatest men he had ever known, his father, his commanding officer, an old mentor from his youth. None of them had ever boasted about their accomplishments, yet their presence alone commanded respect. Not because they sought it, but because they carried themselves with humility. Henry had seen what happened when people talked too much about their own greatness. Pride had a way of turning into arrogance, and arrogance had a way of pushing people away. It turned friends into competitors, admiration into resentment. So Henry chose silence, not because he was ashamed of his achievements, but because he understood that a person's legacy isn't built by the words they speak, it's built by the life they live. Now when people asked about his past, he smiled and said, "I've lived a good life." That was enough. He placed the medal back into the box and closed the lid. It would stay there, not because it wasn't important, but because some things don't need to be displayed to be meaningful. Because in the end, honor isn't found in the stories we tell about ourselves. It's found in the way we carry ourselves when no one is watching. Lesson 8. Past offenses. Let go to be free. Henry pulled out a small, torn letter from the wooden box. The ink had faded, but he didn't need to read the words to remember them. They were burned into his memory, a letter from an old friend, filled with anger, blame, and words that had once cut him deeply. For years, he had held on to it, just as he had held on to the bitterness it carried. He could still recall the moment of betrayal, the feeling of being wronged. A friendship of decades had ended with a single argument, a misunderstanding that had spiraled into silence. The words exchanged had been sharp, unforgiving. Henry had replayed them in his mind over and over, imagining what he should have said, what he should have done differently. But the thing about resentment was that it didn't hurt the other person, it only weighed down the one carrying it. Henry had seen it in others. He had seen men waste years of their lives nursing grudges, refusing to speak to brothers, old friends, even their own children. He had seen how anger hardened into something heavier, how it stole joy from the present by keeping people trapped in the past. And for a long time, he had been one of them. Then, one day, while sitting by the river behind his house, he had watched a fallen leaf drift on the water. It floated effortlessly, carried away by the current, never resisting, never looking back. And he wondered, what if he could do the same? What if he could let go? So Henry made a choice. He took that letter, the one he had kept all those years, and instead of holding it tightly, he released it. Not in anger, not in regret, but in peace. Because he had learned that forgiveness wasn't about the other person, it was about freeing yourself. It didn't mean what had happened was okay. It didn't erase the past, but it meant that the past no longer had power over him. Now, when old wounds threatened to rise again, he reminded himself of the river, of the leaf drifting weightlessly. He chose to flow forward instead of sinking into the past. He folded the letter one last time and placed it back into the box, not as a reminder of pain, but as a lesson. Some things are meant to be carried. Others are meant to be set free. And Henry? He had finally chosen freedom. Lesson 9. Personal beliefs. Keep something sacred for yourself. Henry reached into his wooden box and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It wasn't particularly remarkable. No bright colors, no unusual shape. Just an ordinary stone, yet it was something he had carried with him for years. It had sat in his pocket through long walks, through quiet moments of reflection, through days when he needed something to hold on to. No one else knew its significance. And that was exactly how Henry wanted it. There had been a time when he believed that faith, whatever form it took, was meant to be shared. People spoke openly about their beliefs, debated them, tried to convince others to see the world as they did. Henry had done it himself in his younger days, eager to explain what gave him strength, what guided him through life's hardships. But experience had taught him something different. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone would respect what was sacred to him. And sometimes, in the act of explaining, something precious was lost. He remembered a conversation he had years ago, sitting on his porch with an old friend. They had been discussing life, purpose, and what came after. Henry had shared a deeply personal belief, one that had brought him peace in the darkest times. But instead of understanding, his friend had challenged him, picking apart his words, trying to prove him wrong. Henry hadn't argued. He had simply nodded, changed the subject. But later that night, he felt a quiet sadness. Why had he shared something so deeply personal, only to have it questioned? That was the day he decided that some things, some beliefs, some moments of clarity, some silent prayers, were not meant for the world. They were meant only for him. It didn't mean he didn't listen to others. It didn't mean he wasn't open to different perspectives. But he no longer felt the need to explain the unexplainable, to offer up the most sacred parts of himself for others to dissect. Now, when people asked about his beliefs, he simply smiled and said, "I believe in kindness. I believe in peace. And I believe in keeping some things just for myself." And that was enough. As he held the small stone, he thought of all the quiet moments he had spent with it, how it had become a reminder that faith, in any form, is not always meant to be spoken. It is meant to be felt. He placed the stone back into the box and closed the lid. Because in a world that demanded explanations for everything, Henry had found freedom in holding on to something unspoken, something his alone. Not everything needs to be shared. Some things are most powerful when kept close to the heart. Closing the memory box. Henry sat in the quiet of his home, the wooden box resting on his lap. The lid was slightly open, revealing the collection of small but meaningful objects inside, each a reminder of a lesson learned, of a truth he had come to understand with time. He ran his fingers over the worn edges, feeling the weight of years, of wisdom, of moments both painful and beautiful. He had spent a lifetime gathering experiences, like stones collected along a riverbank. Some were rough, jagged with regret. Others were smooth, polished by time and understanding. Each had its place, but not all needed to be shared. There was a time when he believed that openness meant connection, that to be understood, one had to reveal everything. But age had taught him otherwise. Some things, if spoken too freely, lost their meaning. Some wounds, if reopened too often, never truly healed. Some moments, sacred and deeply personal, were never meant for the world to judge. And so, Henry had learned the art of silence. Not the kind that held secrets out of fear, but the kind that protected peace, that honored what was his alone. He thought of the lessons he had shared, the truth about age, about money, about love and loss, honor and forgiveness. Each one had shaped him, had given him a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. And in the end, what mattered most was not how much he had said, but what he had chosen to keep. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the stillness around him. Then, with quiet reverence, he closed the lid of the wooden box, not to forget, not to bury the past, but to acknowledge that some things belong only to the heart. Outside, the river flowed steadily, carrying leaves and twigs along its surface. It did not hold on to what passed through it. It simply let go, trusting the current to take what needed to go and leave what was meant to stay. Henry smiled to himself. He had finally learned to do the same. There is power in knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. There is peace in understanding that not everything needs to be shared. And so, as the last rays of the sun stretched across the sky, Henry sat back in his chair, the memory box closed beside him, and let the quiet of the evening embrace him. Because, sometimes, the most valuable things in life are not the ones we give away, but the ones we keep safe within us. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the power of keeping something sacred for yourself, leave a comment below. Let's build a space of wisdom and reflection together, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because life is filled with lessons worth learning, and together we can find meaning in every moment. Now, take a deep breath. hold on to what is yours, and move forward with peace.